As prominent and infamous as the story that surrounds Jeffrey Dahmer happens to be, so too it seems that this Netflix production debuted not only with its full presentation, I am covering this a couple days post its release, but even with its trailer debut. This has landed with quite the splash, as other projects have been themed around more notorious faces in world history and more infamous characters, have also had that same response, fittingly. We'll see what I think of Dahmer on a quality standpoint. I do think there are some attributions that at least heighten the prominence of the series from a performance and a production perspective. Ryan Murphy's behind this. He's very well known in regard to recent Netflix productions. He's done a whole lot for them. And this has a bit of a relatable sentiment to some of the other projects that he has produced. This is quite different, though. I mean, this is a biographical piece. In the line of work I'm familiar with from him, it's different in genre. But it doesn't just have the Ryan Murphy attribution. It also has Evan Peters, who I've seen particularly within the comic book sphere. But I am aware that he was in... Isn't American Horror Stories done by Ryan Murphy? I think he has some affiliation there. But Evan Peters did have a role in that series, so horror, or a more dark set series, that's present with him. And he's a good actor, again, from what I've seen him in. Let's say, WandaVision, for example, being a very recent release. Even if his character there, he had a bit of a darker personality, I could see him... I certainly see it with the poster. He looks like Jeffrey Dahmer. But I could see it in his character on how we could manifest such a dark role. Will this series be approachable to everybody? I'm definitely thinking no. There's going to be a couple measures to which I judge this series by on a trailer perspective. I do have an interesting thing to mention when we get to the end of the video, just based on some research I did, at least on the story, because going into this series, I didn't really know at all who Jeffrey Dahmer was. I think maybe I'd heard the name, but I'd never looked into his story in depth. And if you try and actually read, it's... you should earn a trophy if you can get through it. Just reading that Wikipedia bio, it is horrific. One of the most notorious serial killers in America, and, much more than that. Jeffrey Dahmer was a heinous individual in many regards, right? That cannot be excused. Again, I tried reading that. I got most of the way through. I did skip a couple places because it was just such a savage retelling on Wikipedia, but my word. I could see on that measure, given that this is such a dark story, though I'm sure many people do like documentary projects and biographical adaptations, this is maybe not the most palatable release. I'm also considering, this is more in regard to the marketing. I'm curious to see how Netflix revealed this series, beyond just the trailer run. I have some complaints of it going in. Perhaps, though, one of the complaints, at least I can think of as being probable, will evolve based on what I can see from the two trailers I'm going to look at it with today. I am quoted in the past as stating in regards to Netflix content specifically themed around retelling stories surrounding heinous murderers and criminals in America. I'm thinking specifically in regard to Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile. That story, of course, was centered around Ted Bundy. That did start formally as a Voltage Pictures film, and then it got released on Netflix. I expressed, in my coverage with it, a lot of complaints in regard to how Netflix marketed the series. I didn't think the presence of how it was articulated in the ads. I think the marketing run for the series was horrible in regard to matching tone with subject. Painting it as it's this awards picture with all this noteworthy talent and it has this stellar debut. I'm like, that's not really how you treat a project like this. It felt a bit disrespectful to the substance of the story. I'm interested to see if that's carried with Dahmer. I don't think it's got a theater debut, so it doesn't match in regard to that previous picture. I'm curious to see what the execution is here in regard to the marketing. But there are other complaints that seems to be described. I saw a video on YouTube preceding this from somebody within the news and pop culture commentary site. Paul Joseph Watson specifically is his name. he apparently, I guess from his account, has seen the series, but he was talking about in many regards this does not match points of the story, whether it be in angle or in depiction. Sometimes you see projects in regard to true accounts, maybe stories that are inspired by true stories, as the tagline you see quite often, that might variate certain details, right? And that's, of course, pertinent to many series. I mean, I think there are depictions, though, that tend to be more faithful in their adaptations. No translation is perfect, and when you apply a story to the cinema lens, or even the streaming lens, you do have to navigate that process in a certain way, right? Because dramatization is different from storytelling, the streaming atmosphere. Well, this is getting much more extensive runs. It's not like a movie which is more limited in focus. This is a 10-episode production. The storytelling process, it does perhaps change over time. But when you're dealing with a story like this that has quite a depth to it, and a necessity, I think, to preserve it in its authenticity, to honor the stories of the victims, I don't think it's the most respectful lens to perhaps change the angle or change details of the story. Again, you can consult that video again for specific mentions on the plot. I forget some of them, but that video did make note of certain liberties taken by this story. I would imagine, though, again, on a performance debut, this is going to be very strong. Quality, response, that'll evolve with time. I'm going to give my verdict on it here. And of course, maybe you're not familiar with the story. I do think, by the way, the branding for it is kind of weird. Dahmer - Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. Why don't you just call it like Monster : the Jeffrey Dahmer story? Like, I don't know why you have to put Dahmer on there twice. It's kind of strange to me in the way it's titled. But if you're not familiar with the series, this is what you can expect according to IMDb, just a general synopsis. This is the story of the Milwaukee Monster told from the perspective of the victims and police incompetence that allowed the Wisconsin native to go on a multi-year killing spree. So you can see some of the angles there. From my understanding of the general story, again, speaking specifically, well, I think it's honorable to say that this is from the perspective of the victims. It has to be authentically told, right, to match the story. I use the word honor very carefully, honoring the story for the victim's sake, not honoring the story of Jeffrey Dahmer. I do think it is disrespectful, though, even that's mentioned in the synopsis. If this were true to the story, again, I'm going from that one video I referenced, and my general takeaway from the story that I read, on the Wikipedia bio, the police incompetence angle, that seems like a modern contribution, right, to add a social parallel. But if it doesn't fit with the story as history defines it, I don't think it's the most respectful to tailor a story according to that vision, especially when it might perhaps feel alienated to the story in its original context. Let's judge Dahmer, though, from a trailer perspective. Again, I'm a bit late in covering this, so I'm going to queue up trailers 1 and 2, and in a separate video, I'm going to look at a featurette to get a better perspective of the filmmakers behind the movie. Maybe not the filmmakers, I think it's actually more Evan Peters-centric. But let's get and that'll be enticing, because I get to hear maybe more from him on what he envisioned with the performance. Let's see the series in action. I mean, again, I think it's going to have a mixed debut. I don't think everybody's going to want to jump onto this series. I think you have people that might be more open to biographical projects, and I like documentaries and biopic pictures. But even I'm like, just after reading his story, I'm like, I don't know if I really want to entertain this, right? And how far is the series going to go? I mean, is it going to be... I can only take so much in regard to content. There's just parts to his story that I'm not into serial killer entertainment by and large. I don't want to see a lot of the details of the story put on as a visual right in front of me. And I can imagine that there are many people in the audience as well that express the same sympathy that I am. But let's give this a look. I mean, there's only so much I can show in the trailer, of course, to keep it YouTube appropriate. Here we go. I'll be consulting reviews, at least in content, to understand, how far over this goes in my threshold. And I was hitting the max of that Wikipedia read.
Here we are. Home sweet home.
That's a really dark music choice to fit into the context here. I don't know. Ugh. I'm just bracing here. based on, it seems though, again, with different take-in spots.
What do you do in there?
I think the filming techniques are an interesting contribution to add to the story. I think it does feel like a compliment.
Power tools going all hours of the night? I hear screaming coming from your apartment.
It's doing what it needs to do. It's portraying a very distasteful look.
I'm just trying to say I'm sorry.
So the tone is right.
Open your gift.
Although I have doubts again on that music choice, at least on the initial.
You didn't know.
You never know with some people.
I don't know what's in that.
It's just meat.
I'm not eating that.
Okay.
Try to do a nice thing, you know? You're just like my mom. Telling on me when I ain't done nothing wrong.
I called you for months. And it's too late. Y'all came too late.
Eat it.
I still think the branding is really weird. It just seems unnecessary to title Dahmer in there twice. I get why that would work for advertisements and search results, but I don't know. I don't think it's the cleanest presentation on that level. That is going to be a hard watch. I'll come back to this. Let's watch the second trailer so I can get a complete perspective. But I was very unsettled. That's the right tone to have, so that works in its favor. But I don't watch entertainment like this. Again, you know, I'm a fan of thriller and horror stuff. Well, horror I'm much more conditional on, but even I've got my limits. And Jeffrey Dahmer's story, it's like, can I just stick with the reading, right? Do I need to watch the series? Probably not. Especially, again, if there are insertions thrown in here that aren't correct to the original story, then it's like, well, you know, it doesn't feel the most respectful. It seems like a competently portrayed series, and Evan Peters gives off a very strong performance. And one I think does fit the unsettling nature of an unsuspecting serial killer, like Jeffrey Dahmer. Let's take a look at the second trailer, and then I'll give maybe more thoughts in completion. But, oof, in that first trailer, I'm like, I've seen enough. This is nearly 3 minutes long. Oy vey.
You been drinking tonight?
Oh, I just had a couple beers.
What's in the garbage bags?
They're the clippings from the yard.
You're 18, is that right? You got your whole life ahead of you. And I'm not gonna f that up by arresting you tonight, okay? Drive your ass home.
You should have. That didn't seem to me, maybe that's a misrepresentation of the IMDb synopsis.
Glenda, Cleveland, can you send an officer to the Oxford apartment?
Because that didn't portray an incompetent officer.
Or killed.
Just one that misunderstood and misread the situation.
Your job.
Although we all wish it had been different, at least in that scene.
I want to hear your heart.
Vile actions.
You need a second chance. This
Yeesh.
is your lucky day because I'm going to give it to you. And on the other side of this, hopefully, you will have learned your lesson and you'll get your act together.
On hindsight, I understand the perspective of
This man tried to kill me.
of tailoring a certain angle.
Yes.
I called you for months. For months. Somebody is being killed.
I get why that would be a compulsion for the filmmakers,
No matter what we do.
especially with the modern parallels. But I think for a story like this,
managed to escape, and two of your officers.
the biographical connection is important to maintain and preserve the story.
You gonna let him take this baby back inside?
Man, let us do our job.
This is out of control! Look at me! Look at me, mother...
Oh, it's touching on the...
I know,
Is it touching on the baptism angle?
but nobody heard me.
That would be an interesting contribution that is true to a story. In fact, that's what I was going to end the video on. Because it was a... Well, I'll get to it, but it's sort of like, you know, those twists in movies where you didn't expect them and you're like, it comes at you at such a startling realization. Like, I never expected that ending. That's Jeffrey Dahmer's story. I'll get to that, though. Again, it's a fascinating twist. Well, I will say that trailer was a lot easier to tolerate than the first one, even though, again, it's like, just even considering how far it can go, I'm like, this is going to be hitting my threshold quite a bit. And it's like nearly 9-hour series. I don't know, again, how far is Netflix going to go with this? And to some extent, you know, there is a very reasonable argument to be made on featuring a story about a serial killer, right? You don't want it to come across as exploitative of a tragedy. From what I've heard in mention of people who have seen the series, what's been presented to me is mention of a high quality work. And I can see that in the presentation. Not only with the setting, the lighting especially, at the very least on the club scenes, that has, again, an interesting layer when you contextualize it to the Dahmer story. On a presentation note, and in the acting, I think it's quite competent of a release. And that's been the response for, generally speaking, even though I haven't watched all his pictures, Ryan Murphy's Entertainment, at least on Netflix, has gotten that really good word of mouth. And, you know, I forget again how affiliated he is to American Horror Stories. But even that series has gotten good recognition. I got people in my circle that have watched it and like the show. I've never seen it, but I know that Evan Peters was on the show, right? So he fits in for a show that has the atmosphere of what would be akin to a pretty severe, like, thriller horror picture. And this certainly has the tonality. The tone is right. The tone feels, again, you don't want to portray this in any way to be a lighthearted picture, right? I did think, again, on that first trailer, that music choice, I know they revised the sound of it on the second half of the trailer as it played. I don't think it was the right way to go in. Maybe they were trying to paint it like, okay, this is from the victim's perspective. This is an unsuspecting venture of what you're about to walk into. But I don't know if it... I don't know. I will say my response to it doesn't necessarily have the... I'm not completely enticed with the series, the prospect of me watching it, but I'm less grieved than I was with the marketing campaign for Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile. That, to me, again, just felt disrespectful in the way that Netflix portrayed it, and then matching it to the Ted Bundy story. This felt a bit more in line with what you would expect to be a more respectable portrayal. Maybe not perfect in parts. Again, a competent series. But with the elements, again, that were, from my understanding, revised. And to be clear on the IMDb point, yeah, the police incompetence angle, that's a detail, again, that I've heard stressed in that video that I mentioned. That was just the evidence of what I heard that the series portrayed on part of somebody who said that he had seen the series in its entire presentation. More power to you, I guess, if you can stomach it. Like, I'm very hesitant to watch a series for myself, as I imagine that'll be the general response from many audience members of, I like true stories, or at least stories that are inspired by true works, at the very least are trying to portray that, even with, again, maybe the inspired element here considered. But, my threshold only goes so far, right? And humanity, we're living in a fallen world, and sometimes people do heinous things, right? You know, everybody makes mistakes, but some people go further than others, and Jeffrey Dahmer was one of those cases. And I do think, again, the tone of the series, that matches. Maybe it's just a misportrayal with the IMDb synopsis. I read the whole police incompetence thing, and I know if it's been an argument that was stressed, again, that video I mentioned with where this series goes and in specifying its direction. I don't see that, at least on the introduction. I could see that possibly evolving. I also see, again, I get the temptation to marry this to a more modern commentary, because the factors are persistent in that story to match it to that context. And projects that do have that social parallel baseline, which a lot of fare does these days, some shows are quite strong. But I think this is an interesting case where that might be portrayed well, but it does seem in some part to be disrespectful in honoring the portrayal of the story as it exists according to history. Preserving the reality in its, or at the very least, again, no translation is perfect, but trying to preserve that story to accurately depict what happened. That could be a complaint that I see, even though, again, I get the temptation. Another part, in fact, that I was saying with the revisions, that video also mentioned that the actress here, who seems to be pretty competent, I mean, her performance, I buy it in the role. I buy her anguish. I buy her pain. But apparently she didn't even live in the same building, so that's not exactly a true element here either. What you're seeing is a story with some varied details from what was originally Dahmer's story. Time will tell, I think, for the general audience, you know, and I'd be interested to hear what angle you come from down below. Would you humor this project, or would you try and stomach the Wikipedia biography? Again, I had to skip certain sections. I'm like, this is just, in some parts, you know, you read that, and it was just such a heinous account. I'm like, it's just too much for me to read. It's true. It's just, and I don't normally like to cite Wikipedia, but in this case, they were good as a quick reference. I have my reasons why. I mean, even apart from the academic side to it, we're like, you know, it's kind of, you know, given a stink eye in academia and research citations. I don't really like Wikipedia as a platform, but reading that story, I think it was a good accounting. It's just hard to swallow. So, would you stick with? Would you want to watch this? Do you find it an accessible release to your tastes, or do you think it crosses your threshold where you'd be more likely to read a biographical entry? And, you know, tempt where your threshold is there. Let me know what your thoughts are down below. I think it'd be an interesting way to gauge the audience. It does seem in parts to be depicting the story in its entirety, right? An 8-hour series allows for that. I was curious if they were going to go down the baptism angle. Like I said, twist ending of a Dahmer story. And I found it actually really, again, unexpected. Like, you get through probably about an hour reading documentation of a heinous individual, only to find out that it took that much barbarity and a prison sentence for him to find God. It's crazy to me. I'll tell you, in the case that anybody misinterprets my words, I want to be very careful in how I say this. I'm not trying to, in any way, shed a positive light, other than the ending to his story is very unusual. And if there's, you know, something that I could say, you know, I want my content on here, to the best of my extent and control, to be edifying in some way. And talking about the actions of a serial killer, and witnessing at the very least an introduction of that with this Netflix series. Again, you know, time will tell how far it goes on a watch. I just don't know if I want to sit through this. It's really interesting to see some people's stories. I never expected, after getting through an extensive read of many inhumane, cruel, inexcusable, heinous acts, I didn't expect the resolution of that to be he found faith and he found God. And that was just such a crazy point to hit on that I'm like, it really took me back when I first read it. If there's anything that I could say in regard to painting a positive, uplifting direction to this video, rather than just spending the entirety talking about the actions of a serial killer. If there's anything to be learned from Jeffrey Dahmer's story, apart from, be careful where you go and who you find yourself in the company of, and never fully trust anybody, I think that's a fitting lesson. Never consider anybody beyond God's reach. That's fascinating to me, that the end of his story, and it's interesting to see again, I wondered if Netflix would touch on it, and it seems that they have, that in the end, he found some reconciliation with God. I'm still stunned as I bring that point up. Even he understood the undeniable wrongness in his actions. I mean, he even admitted that. Like, didn't he say he was, I think it was a quote, like he said, I'm either sick or evil or something like that. I think he rested with sick. But even with all that, he still found, it's such a, it's such a weird realization to consider. But what really impressed on me in the days before I covered this, obviously, and reading that story, it was fairly recent. And I've said it before on this channel, I'm sure many people would agree, to different contexts. I mean, again, we all make mistakes, but not everybody goes as far as Jeffrey Dahmer did. I think most people don't. We, have that line and you would never cross it. But I, in my personal life, deal with a lot of self-hatred. My mistakes weigh on me greatly. And I'm a Christian, obviously I have a disposition that restoration is sought through God. And that's where salvation is found. It was interesting for me, and maybe it was just what God impressed on my heart as I read that story. Nobody truly is beyond forgiveness from an eternal standpoint. Even my actions, right? As condemned as I might feel sometimes, even though there's a passage in the Bible that talks about, from the perspective of a Christian, that I'm trying to remember exactly how it is. I'll reference it, of course, to correctly state it. But there is no condemnation with Christ. But even so, your sin has condemned you. It amazes me if I look at somebody like Jeffrey Dahmer, and I consider that even he's not beyond forgiveness. From an eternal perspective, that even God could forgive him. Whereas on earth, our first inclination would be to immediately, that his actions are unforgivable. But even then somebody like Jeffrey Dahmer can find forgiveness with God. It's just such a crazy point to me. But I'm sitting with that. I finish reading it, and I get to that point, and I'm just, even amidst me voluntarily admitting that I'm a Christian, I will state I struggle with the feeling of forgiveness quite a bit. My sins weigh on me pretty much every day. There's not a day that goes by that I don't in some way feel condemned, even when Scripture speaks the opposite, in regard to where my faith stands and what God sees. But the human side of you, and while you're on the surf, perhaps maybe you speak to the same feeling. I oftentimes go through my life feeling unforgiven. My sin, my guilt, just shrouds me. Even again, if it's something for, let's say, as insignificant, like it's just a simple mistake, right? Not something like serial killing. That's a whole nother level. But even something, small, or a little white lie or something like that, as people say. I'm just picking an example. Even that, weighs on me. And there are so many times in my life where I look at my mistakes, and by many measures, they define my self-perception. And I walk through my days, feeling such guilt and hatred over my mistakes and my failings. I would imagine a lot of people can relate to that. We all have mistakes that we make on an imperfect world. The sin condition, I believe, does stick with all of us. And maybe you're in the position thinking of your mistakes like me on an emotional level, or perhaps, more concretely, you're of the mindset where, and it's an understandable feeling. It's very relatable. Many people deal with it. You feel that your mistakes can't ever be forgiven, that you're irredeemable. If Jeffrey Dahmer, someone like him, can find forgiveness with God, can't he do the same for you? Even amidst a small mistake. You're, I'm sure, not a convicted serial killer, or even an unconvicted one, right? Most people are not, admittedly. But even amidst your shortcomings and failings, and I say that without judgment, again, I have so many skeletons in my closet. Not literally, bad comparison to use. The context of Dahmer, yeah, that's not a good one. It's just ease of wording I picked. Sorry. Even amidst your failings, God can forgive you too. If he can forgive Jeffrey Dahmer, and if Jeffrey Dahmer can find forgiveness with God and repentance for his wrongs, can't he do the same for you? I think that's such an interesting end to Dahmer's story. And again, I don't mean in any way to lessen his crimes. It's inhumane what he did. I just found that such a weird twist. And over the week or so that I've since read that, it just stuck with me. It's such an unusual lesson to manifest, but hey, God works in strange and mysterious ways sometimes. It's certainly a fascinating story by every measure. And it's really curious again for me to see that Netflix did pick up on that point, right? That is a part of a Dahmer story, so it makes sense in terms of preserving, at least broadly speaking, the majority of real events of what took place. I didn't expect to see that. Maybe that scene will be okay for a watch. Again, I'm going to watch that featurette to get a better perspective of at least Evan Peters on his role in a subsequent video to this. But the series as a whole, while I think it's marketed a bit better than Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile, it still is hard for me to consider sitting through watching this. Again, I'm not into serial killer fare, and considering that there are some revisions of the story that perhaps taint its presentation of maintaining an authentic translation, that it does sort of dissuade me. We'll see what happens. Again, I'm curious to hear what angle you come from down below. Would you be interested in this, or does this cross your threshold? What would you ever read a biographical piece and last through that, or would you watch a series, a dramatization? I mean, how far again does this series go? I would really hope I don't have to actually sit through. I hope that Netflix will be professional about this and, respectful. Sitting through a bunch of heinous murder scenes, I would not want to do that, and I worry that that'd be a part of a series. If, you so choose to watch it. I don't know. I might just stick with the story. But the presentation from a filming standpoint, and from a performance standpoint, and from a tone of the trailers, for the most part, provides a very competent lens. Dahmer's been a complex case to unravel, or Dahmer, Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. Again, that branding, I think, needed some revision, but it's an interesting watch to consider, to say the least. Thank you so much for watching this video. Before you bounce, feel free to drop a like and comment, subscribe to this channel with a ding on the bell, and share this video with your friends. And consider checking out the description here. There you'll find links to my other channels, as well as addresses to my other social media accounts and ways you can help support my work if you feel so inclined. May God bless you, and looking forward to when our paths cross again.